So Lars asked me today to give this talk on terminology and fundamentals, specifically focusing on regulations and risk assessment of nanomaterials. So this talk will be a bit more general than a wetlands talk, but obviously most of the things that I'm discussing are relevant to a wetlands, just the environment. So let's see if I can make this work. So very briefly, I'm just going to set the scene with this presentation. I'm going to specifically focus initially on the definition of a nanomaterial, then go through some of the working groups and sort of tools that exist in terms of regulating nanomaterials within the environment and also for human health, and then focus a little bit on the sort of hazard and risk assessment of nanomaterials, some of the issues and data quality issues, etc. So obviously, most people, I'm assuming most people in the audience are aware of the issues with nanomaterials and the fact that they're such a breakthrough with their new properties, etc., and the importance of them and the new products that they're being involved in. And the number of products is increasing very, very rapidly compared to the regulatory tools that exist to regulate them, which I'll touch on. Obviously, we see the nanomaterials are innovations with a lot of benefits. However, there's still a lot of issues and uncertainties about health and safety in the environment and to human health. So I just want to give with this presentation really an overview, go through some of the terminology and acronyms, there's plenty of acronyms, and some of the tools for the hazard and risk assessment. Also, to sort of mention that I'm going to focus on an EU, sort of European level. We could talk as well about the US, etc., but then that would be a much, much bigger presentation. So for the purposes of our EU cost action, I'm just going to focus on Europe. So the EU approach, when it comes to sort of the regulation of nanomaterials, is this sort of idea that we have a safe and integrated assessment. And in 2004, they published a document specifically towards a European strategy for nanotechnology, in which they were focusing on the safety assessment. They wanted to promote safe and cost-effective measurements or measures, and they also discussed the developing of terminology, which I'm going to touch on, guidelines, models, and specific guidelines for the assessment and risk, and the adaptation rather of existing regulations. Here's just a little sort of table about the chronology of the EU regulations since 2004 and the various documents that have been published. And this is just from Nanoregulations in the European Union, a 2010 document.
Excuse my interruption, but will it be possible to give us the presentations later, or
yes,
do
I'd be
you
happy.
see them as
I'd be happy to share. So,
as a matter of fact, we're recording, so presumably they'll be distributed.
It will be available on.
Okay, very good, thanks. Sorry.
no problem. So specifically the regulatory challenges for nanomaterials, there's obviously a lot of current regulatory frameworks within environmental and human health assessment, but the idea is that these may not be 100% suitable for the specific nano-specific issues. Information on the nanomaterials on the market is very, very incomplete. At the moment, there's quite a lot of information and country-by-country specific sort of, what would you call them, initiatives where they are trying to come up with databases within the countries, looking at the actual amount of nanomaterial containing products that are on the market. For example, Denmark are developing one at the moment, and along with Denmark, we're planning on developing one for Norway as well, and there's other countries. There's specific gaps in the toxicology, phys-chem, exposure data, and therefore without this information, it's very hard to perform a full risk assessment, and it becomes very challenging. There's a number of activities that are aiming to improve the regulations and governance of nanomaterials, and that's what I want to focus on today with my talk, is mainly going through these sort of tools or activities. So in terms of the current situation, the EU definition of a nanomaterial has been released in 2011 with some adaptations since then, which I'll discuss. And obviously there's a lot of legislative tools that apply to nanomaterials as well, such as REACH and CLP. There's also product-specific legislation, and then there's also national regulatory activities. But I'm going to focus more on the REACH side of things for this talk. So in 2011, there was an EC recommendation on the definition of a nanomaterial, and I know that other people may mention this during the course of today. Specifically, they stated in this recommendation for a definition that it's a natural, incidental or manufactured material containing particles unbound or aggregated or agglomerated where 50% or more of the particles in the number size distribution range between 1 and 100 nanomaterials in at least one dimension. They discussed that this was going to be up for review in 2014, which I will get to. So by December 2014, the definition from the directive, or the definition rather, was reviewed in reflecting the experiences that people have had with the definition. And then in 2004 they published 2 reports in March and October, I think, specifically focusing on people's experience of using the definition. So there are those 2 reports. And then this summer, they've issued the final 3rd report from the JRC, specifically focusing on recommendations for changes to the definition. So in conclusion for this, they basically assessed all the separate parts of the definition, what a particle is, the size distribution, the thresholds for the size, and various other aspects of it. And they laid out the report in a way that they gave the option of not changing the definition and what that meant for how it was applied, and then they gave options for how we could change it, or how we could add extra guidance on the use or under interpretation of the guidelines, or of the definition rather. So specific issues that were identified in this final report was clarity on the term particle, and one of the things was about colloidal systems, and whether the nanoparticles within a colloidal system should be considered as an entity on their own, or the solution in which they were suspended, whether they should be considered as part of the nano product and manufactured nanomaterial. Initially, they're going more towards the idea that you deal with the particles within a colloidal system. But this has quite a lot of implications from a regulatory point of view, because if, for example, for REACH, you consider the liquid in which the suspension is being held, then you have to also do a specific characterization of that liquid, and that also needs to be registered, not just the actual particle within the suspension. They also discussed the boundary or the threshold of 1 to 100 nanometers, and specifically nobody wants to decrease that, but there is discussions about whether we increase. Specifically in nanomedicines, they sometimes use a threshold of 1,000 nanometers to define a nanomaterial. And then the other issue is about this 50% of the particles within are considered to be nanomaterial, i.e. 1 to 100 nanomaterials within one dimension. And this is quite difficult because there's an issue about the way in which we measure nanomaterials. So you have a number-based size distribution, usually is how we assess it. And this is very, very hard. We want a numbers-based assessment so that we can calculate what's 50%. But usually the way we measure it is based on a mass. And it's very hard to convert to the two, or between the two. So this is quite fine, is 50%. So just to touch on some other recent activities, obviously since 2004 and before, there's been big issues as to whether nanotechnology really merits its own special government regulations. So within the EU, we have lots of different tools, specifically REACH and CLP. I won't talk about CLP today, but this is the classification of labelling and packaging. And then you also have product-specific legislation that incorporate nanomaterials into their regulations, for example, biocides, cosmetics, pesticides, etc. There are also a lot of working groups within the European Union and within Europe in general, such as ECHA's Nanomaterial Working Group. You also have the GARN, which is about existing registered nanomaterials. The OECD have a working party on manufactured nanomaterials, and there's various other advisory groups and expert groups that advise to the European Commission, such as the CARICAL, which is the competent authorities for REACH and CLP, so they advise the REACH and CLP. So just to touch very briefly, for those who may not be very aware with ECHA and what their actual role is, ECHA is the European Chemicals Agency, and specifically it's the main party in regulatory authorities implementing any EU legislation for chemicals. It also acts as a support tool for companies, that need to comply with the various legislation and regulatory tools. So REACH is entered into force in 2007. It's the registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals. And the idea of implementing or introducing REACH was to sort of streamline and improve existing frameworks that were there for the safety assessment of chemicals and the registration, and specifically to improve health and environmental safety, and it's sort of governed by the European Chemical Agency. With regard to nanomaterials, initially when there was registration dossiers, there was a voluntary sort of tick box as to whether your product was a nanomaterial or not. And there was also a lot of confusion when people were registering their products as to exactly what a nanomaterial was and whether they had to state that it was a nanomaterial and what sort of form. The Commission has now decided to prepare modifications in some of the REACH annexes, specifically to guide registrants, etc. And I was at a ECHO working group in March, and they were meant to have these annexes finished and presented to the public, I think, in June or July of this year, and they announced that they would not be ready. So this is a very important thing when dealing with nanomaterials risk assessment regulations. The regulatory tools and processes are very, very slow, and they're not really keeping up with the number of particles or products coming up on the market. So this is a real sort of bottleneck in the regulation and risk assessment. I was just going to mention something very briefly in terms of REACH and nano that's come up in the press just, I think, last month. Silicon dioxide has been selected for evaluation through REACH, and ECHA have decided that there is a nano form of the product, and therefore they've required the registrants of silicon dioxide to provide extra information for the dossier, including testing and various phys-chem information. However, there are now 35 EU-based companies, some of these very big companies, that are now appealing ECHA's decision that this silicon dioxide should be evaluated. This also has very, very big implications for other nanomaterials that are supposedly meant to be evaluated in the next few years, specifically I think it's silver and titanium dioxide. So these companies, their argument is that ECHA has no power under REACH to actually state what information is required on the various nanoforms. And in addition, they argue that ECHA is not empowered to classify synthetic amorphous silica as a nanomaterial. So this sort of defeats the purpose of the definition. Who's going to implement that definition? So this is ongoing, and it's quite an interesting sort of topic. You can find some easy information about it just on that Chemical Watch website. So other sort of specific activities that are going towards helping us with the issues surrounding nanomaterial risk assessment and regulation is the OECD's program. And they have various projects, and this was started quite a long time ago. Most of these projects are sort of coming to an end now, and reports should be coming out soon, we hope. But I'm just going to focus on this manufactured nanomaterials and test guidelines. So this is taking a selection of standard synthesized nanomaterials. I think they're mainly produced by the JRC, and assessing the various OECD guidelines against the nanomaterials for the application of phys-chem, human tox, ecotox, bioaccumulation, and seeing whether the existing guidelines that are used for regulation are applicable to nanomaterials. So the purpose of testing these guidelines and ensuring that we're all using the same sort of harmonized way of assessing, whether it's phys-chem or tox or exposure assessment, is that within the OECD, if you are conducting tests according to these guidelines, you're conducting them with good laboratory practice, it's implied that this data will be mutually accepted across all OECD countries. Therefore, it avoids duplication of testing, it saves a lot of money, and in another sense, one of my interests is the reduction of animals, using less animals and potentially coming up with alternatives. With regard to the OECD, the conclusion in general is that a lot of the guidelines that exist are acceptable for the assessment of nanomaterials, but they need more specific guidelines, a guidance document, maybe a technical guidance document on nano-specific things that have to be addressed. And this is especially important in the phys-chem side of things, but in terms of the ecotox, they're pretty much applicable in most cases. We also have the ISO, the International Standards Organization, which are also assessing various guidelines and standards for the assessment of nanomaterials, and they have actually published some nano-specific guidance documents, or not guidance, standards. So in terms of the risk assessment, the hypothesis...
I had a question to the
Yeah.
slide before. With the Git laboratory approach, I just learned that it excludes most of the university studies that have been done.
Yes, you have to be a GLP laboratory, that your national competence or your national authority will bestow upon you that you have the ability to conduct these tests. And it's quite a rigorous system, and it involves a lot of training. And that's one of the things that I will get to just at the very end about the issue with a lot of non-GLP studies for nanomaterials. So yeah, specifically focusing then on the risk assessment. Obviously, the hypothesis that smaller means more reactive and more toxic cannot be substantiated by the published data with regard to nanomaterials. And so they are similar to what you would consider normal substances in that some are toxic, some are not. And although this may imply that normal chemicals and nanomaterials could be treated similarly, that's not the case. We need to treat nanomaterials more on a case-by-case basis, which can be very costly. In terms of the risk assessment sort of paradigm, the classical approach is still applicable to nanomaterials. So you're talking about hazard identification, assessment, exposure assessment, and then the evaluation of the risk posed. However, there's a lot of gaps that we can't conduct a full risk assessment with the nanomaterials. So obviously there's knowledge gaps. The framework is still unresolved. Like I talked, there's a lot of bottlenecks within the regulatory side of things, so things aren't moving very fast. There's obviously particle-specific complexities, and they demand much more targeted nanomaterial approaches to assess them. Something that I'm sure my colleagues will touch on is the ability to routinely measure and predict nanomaterial concentrations in the environmental compartment, which really is a hindrance for a full comprehensive risk assessment. The lack of validated methods, which are now slowly coming to the fore, which is good. Again, there's a major lack of long-term and population-relevant effects, and guidance, specific guidance on how we can include results from non-standardized testing and/or testing that hasn't been done according to GLP. And then there's this need for a case-by-case approach, which they are trying now within the European Commission and ECHA to kind of try and develop guidelines for the grouping, categorization of nanomaterials so that we can deal with them in a broader sense. But this is highly complex and no real decisions have been made as of yet. So just talking about the GLP aspects and the data quality and risk assessment, this is a very, very important thing. If you put crap in, you're going to get crap out. So we need to ensure that the quality of the data going into a risk assessment. It needs to be reliable, relevant, whether it's ecotox, tox, physchem, and we need this information to derive safe levels, environmental quality standards, PNEX, or for registration purposes within something like REACH. So the data quality requires specific test guideline standards and GLP. And then in terms of assessing the data quality, I've done this talk a few times about the data quality, but I won't go into too much detail if people want to ask any questions afterwards. It's usually performed according to CLIMISH, which is a scale in which they allocate a number to the quality of the data. Number 1 being the best. It's reliable without restrictions, the quality of your data. However, nanomaterial tox studies not done to GLP and not done according to standard guidelines will never get a number 1. So are these data quality assessment tools correct for nanomaterials? And they may not be, because a lot of the work that we do is more bespoke, researchy work that is very important and should be used, not just standard testing all the time. There are other methods. I think Ailbhe have their own data quality assessment, EFSA, and a few other organizations, the US EPA, etc., for assessing data that may not fit in with this CLIMISH scale. So very quickly to finish up, I hope it hasn't been too rushed. In terms of a development towards a solution, there are a lot of big projects at a European level, as well as an international level. specifically in FP7 and the New Horizon 2020 projects that are going towards sort of helping with risk assessment and regulatory issues surrounding nanomaterials in the environment or for human health. And there's a lot of experience now from member states who've had to deal with the registration and reporting schemes within the regulatory context. As I mentioned, ISO now have standards published for various aspects of nanomaterials that can be used, and they give a little bit more strength to the regulatory acceptance of some of this work. And then we are, I guess, still waiting for some of the outcomes from the OECD sponsorship programs, like I mentioned, assessing the test guidelines. And there's still lots of ongoing work at a sort of ECHA level, where they're talking about this working party, or the nanomaterial working group for ECHA, where they're discussing things like categorization, which would simplify things if it was possible to do it in a streamlined way, which so far they're still talking. There will be documents released some stage.